The dust never settled on the Broken Arrow Ranch, not in the way that mattered. Samuel McKenna had been telling himself for 3 years that the grit coating every surface of his life was just part of living on the frontier, but deep down he knew better. The dust came from the emptiness inside him, stirring up with every lonely morning and settling thick as grief on everything he touched. He stood on his porch that September morning in 1887, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, watching the horizon stretch endlessly toward nothing. 42 years old, and he'd built something out here in the Colorado territory that should have made him proud. 2,000 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy ranch house, cattle that bore his brand, and enough money in the bank to weather most storms. But pride was a luxury he'd forgotten how to afford since Martha died. The letter in his vest pocket crinkled as he shifted his weight. It had arrived 3 days ago, carried by a rider from Denver who'd looked at Samuel with something between pity and curiosity. The letter was from a man named Jeremiah Carver, a businessman who dealt in what he called domestic arrangements for frontier settlers. Samuel had written to him in a moment of weakness 2 months prior, after finding himself talking to Martha's portrait for the better part of an evening, his voice echoing hollow in the quiet house. Now Carver was coming today with what he described as a suitable arrangement for Samuel's situation. The rancher had paid $500 sight unseen, a fortune by any measure for what Carver promised would be companion to ease the burdens of frontier solitude. Samuel wasn't proud of the transaction, but loneliness had a way of making decisions that shame wouldn't. The distant rumble of wagon wheels drew his attention to the road. A black carriage approached through the heat shimmer, moving at a steady pace that suggested its occupants were in no hurry to arrive. Samuel straightened his shoulders and walked down from the porch, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He'd shaved that morning and put on his best shirt, though he couldn't say why it mattered. Jeremiah Carver stepped down from the carriage first, a thin man in an expensive suit that looked ridiculous in the frontier heat. He had the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices and drawing rooms, and his smile was too practiced to be genuine. Behind him, the carriage door opened again, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. She was nothing like what he'd expected. Where he'd imagined a worn-down woman grateful for any kind of security, he found himself looking at someone who burned with an inner fire that seemed barely contained. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire and green eyes that assessed him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. But it was the way she held herself that struck him most, like a wild horse that had been temporarily caught but never truly broken. "Mr. McKenna," Carver said with his oily smile, "allow me to present Miss Catherine O'Brien, though I believe she prefers to be called Wild." The woman, Wild, stepped forward and extended her hand with a directness that surprised him. Her grip was firm, caroused from work, and she looked him straight in the eye. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent softened by years in America. "I hope you know what you're getting yourself into." There was a challenge in her words, a warning wrapped in what might have been humor. Samuel found himself studying her face, looking for the submission he'd expected, the grateful compliance that Carver had assured him would come with the arrangement. Instead, he saw intelligence, wariness, and something else that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I'm beginning to wonder that myself," he replied honestly, surprising them both. Carver cleared his throat and launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech about terms and expectations, but Samuel barely heard him. He was watching Wild as she surveyed the ranch, her eyes taking in the corrals, the barn, the house, and the endless stretch of land beyond. She wasn't looking at it like someone appraising a new home. She was looking at it like someone calculating distances to the horizon. When Carver finished his business and departed in a cloud of dust and self-satisfaction, Samuel found himself alone with this woman who carried wildness in her very name. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of their strange transaction hanging between them like a challenge neither was ready to accept. "You hungry?" he asked finally, because it was practical and safe. "Always," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested she'd known real hunger. He led her into the house, acutely aware of how it must look to her. It was clean but sparse, functional without warmth. Martha's things were still scattered throughout. Not because he couldn't bear to move them, but because he'd simply forgotten how to see them. The house had become a place where he slept and ate, Nothing more. Wilde moved through the rooms like water, touching nothing but seeing everything. She paused at Martha's photograph on the mantel, a wedding portrait where his younger self smiled beside a woman with kind eyes and soft features. When Wilde turned back to him, her expression had softened slightly. She was beautiful, Wilde said simply. She was, Samuel agreed, waiting for the familiar stab of pain. It came but duller than usual, as if Wilde's presence had somehow cushioned it. They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and preserved meat, eating mostly in silence. Samuel found himself stealing glances at her, trying to understand what he'd brought into his life. She ate with focus, like someone who'd learned not to waste food, but her manners were refined enough to suggest she hadn't always lived rough. "Where are you from?" he asked eventually. "Everywhere and nowhere," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "My family came from Ireland when I was 12. Fiver took them in Chicago. I've been making my own way since." The simple statement carried years of hardship, and Samuel felt a familiar ache in his chest. That's a hard road for anyone, especially a young woman. Wilde's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "Hard roads make you strong or they break you. I'm still here." After the meal, Samuel showed her to the spare room he'd prepared. It was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Wilde stood in the doorway for a long moment, not entering. "What exactly do you expect from this arrangement, Mr. McKenna?" she asked suddenly. The directness of the question caught him off guard. He'd been dreading this conversation, unsure himself what he wanted or needed from whatever this was between them. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Company, I suppose. Someone to share meals with. Someone to talk to when the silence gets too heavy." She studied his face as if looking for lies. "And that's all. That's all I'm asking for," he said carefully. Anything else would have to be freely given. Something in her posture relaxed slightly. "Good. Because I've had enough of men taking what they think they're owed." That night, Samuel lay awake listening to the sounds of another person in his house. He could hear Wilde moving around occasionally, the creak of floorboards under unfamiliar feet, the sound of water being poured for washing. It had been so long since the house held anyone but him that these simple sounds seemed profound. The next morning, he found her in the kitchen before dawn, coffee already made and bacon sizzling in the pan. She'd changed from her traveling dress into work clothes, practical pants and a cotton shirt that made her look even more like she belonged on the frontier than in a parlor. "Figured I'd earn my keep," she said without preamble. "I'm not much for sitting idle." They fell into a routine over the following days that surprised them both with its ease. Wilde threw herself into the work of the ranch with an intensity that left Samuel both impressed and concerned. She could handle horses better than most men he'd known, mended fence with steady hands, and worked in the vegetable garden behind the house with a skill that suggested she'd grown her own food before. But she worked with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun her own thoughts. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Wilde would watch the horizon with an expression he couldn't read, while Samuel found himself watching her instead of the sunset. She had a way of holding herself that suggested she was always ready to run, even when she was sitting perfectly still. "You ever been married, Wilde?" he asked one evening, immediately regretting the personal question. "What?" she said after a long pause, to a man who thought buying a wife meant owning her completely. I disagreed. The way she said it, flat and final, told him more than he wanted to know about how that marriage had ended. "I'm sorry," he said.
"Don't be, I'm not."
She turned to look at him then, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. "What about you? What was she like, your Martha?" Samuel found himself talking about his wife for the first time in years, really talking about her. He told Wilde about Martha's laugh, how she'd sing while she worked, how she'd made the house feel alive just by being in it. He talked about the baby they'd lost, the fever that took Martha 3 months later, the way the silence had moved in afterward like a living thing. Wilde listened without offering empty comfort or useless platitudes. When he finished, she simply nodded. "Love like that doesn't come often," she said. "You were lucky to have it, even for a little while." As autumn deepened into winter, something began to shift between them. It wasn't romance, not yet, but something deeper and more complex. They developed an easy companionship built on shared work and comfortable silences. Wilde's defensive wariness slowly gave way to something that resembled trust, while Samuel found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't since Martha died. but Wild carried secrets like stones in her pockets, heavy and sharp, edged. Samuel would catch her staring toward the road sometimes, her whole body tense as if she were listening for something. She jumped at unexpected sounds and never sat with her back to a door. When he asked about it, she'd deflect with humor or change the subject entirely. The truth came riding up to the ranch on a cold December morning in the form of 3 men who sat their horses like they were comfortable with violence. Samuel was mending harness in the barn when he heard Wild's sharp intake of breath from the corral, where she'd been working with a young colt. "Get in the house," she said without taking her eyes off the approaching riders, her voice carrying an authority he'd never heard from her before. "This is my land," Samuel replied, moving to stand beside her. "Please," she said, and the fear in her voice made his blood run cold. "Just this once, trust me and get inside." But it was too late. The riders had reached the yard, and the man in the center, a hard-faced brute with pale eyes and a star pinned to his vest, was smiling in a way that made Samuel's hand drift toward his gun. Well, the man said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "If it isn't little Catherine Murphy, though I hear you're calling yourself something else these days." Wild's face had gone pale, but her voice was steady. "Marshal Dowd. I wondered when you'd come looking." 3 months. Dowd said, swinging down from his horse. 3 months I've been tracking you across 4 territories. You've led me quite a chase, girl." Samuel stepped forward, his confusion giving way to protective anger. "You're on my land, Marshal. State your business or move along." Dowd's cold eyes flicked to Samuel with amusement. "Your business, is it? Well, mister?" He looked at Samuel expectantly. "McKenna. Samuel McKenna. Well, Mr. McKenna, your business there is wanted for murder back in Kansas. Catherine Murphy, also known as Wild O'Brien, wanted for the killing of her lawful husband, Deputy Marshal Thomas Murphy." Dowd's smile widened. "Though I suspect she didn't mention that little detail when you made your arrangement." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He turned to look at Wild, searching her face for denial, for explanation, for anything that would make this make sense. What he found instead was resignation and something that might have been relief. "It's true," she said quietly, meeting his eyes. "I killed him." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind and the creak of leather as the other 2 men shifted in their saddles. Samuel felt the ground beneath his feet become uncertain, everything he thought he knew about Wild rearranging itself into new and terrible patterns. "Well now," Dowd continued, clearly enjoying himself, "the way I see it, Mr. McKenna, you've got 2 choices. You can hand over the murderess, and I'll pretend I never saw you harboring a fugitive, or you can interfere with the law, and I'll have to consider you an accomplice." Samuel's mind raced. 3 months she'd been here. 3 months of shared meals and quiet conversations, of watching her gentle a frightened horse or tend to a wounded chicken with infinite patience. 3 months of slowly coming back to life in ways he hadn't thought possible. And now this. "What happened in Kansas?" he asked Wild, ignoring Dowd's impatient snort. Wild's eyes never left his face. Thomas was a deputy marshal and a drunk. He liked to use his fists when the whiskey got to him, and he didn't much care whether it was on criminals or his wife. "The night I killed him, he'd beaten me near unconscious, then started in on the neighbor's little girl, who'd come looking for help when her mother took ill. I put a kitchen knife between his ribs." The raw honesty in her voice cut through Samuel like a blade. He could see the truth of it in her eyes, in the way she held herself, in the faint scar along her jaw that he'd noticed but never asked about. "Self-defense," Samuel said to Dowd. "Defense of a child." Dowd laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "That's not how the law sees it, friend. Thomas Murphy was a peace officer killed by his wife. Dead is dead and murder is murder." Samuel looked at the 3 men, noting the casual way they wore their guns, the confidence that came from being used to having their way. Behind him, he could feel Wild's tension like a living thing, her readiness to run or fight or both. "How much?" Samuel asked suddenly. Dowd raised an eyebrow. "Come again. How much to forget you found her?" The marshal's laugh was genuinely amused now. "You think this is about money, McKenna? This is about justice. About a woman knowing her place." And suddenly Samuel understood. This wasn't about law or justice or even revenge. This was about power. About men like Dowd who couldn't stand the idea of a woman fighting back and winning. He'd seen it before, the way some men treated the frontier like their personal kingdom, where they could take what they wanted and punish anyone who resisted. "Justice," Samuel repeated, his voice flat. That what you call hunting down a woman who defended herself and a child? Dowd's expression darkened. Careful, McKenna. I'm being generous here, giving you a chance to walk away clean. Samuel felt something shift inside him. A door closing on the man who'd spent 3 years hiding from life, and another opening on someone he'd forgotten he could be. He thought about Martha, about how she despised bullies and cowards. He thought about Wild, working beside him with quiet determination, slowly coaxing smiles from him he'd thought were gone forever. No, he said simply. The word hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Dowd's face went through several expressions before settling on dangerous amusement. No, she's under my protection, Samuel said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. You want her, you'll have to go through me. Wild stepped up beside him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body. Samuel, no. This isn't your fight. Yes, it is, he said without taking his eyes off Dowd. The moment you became part of this place, it became my fight. Dowd shook his head sadly. Well, that's a damn shame, McKenna. I was hoping we could settle this civilized-like. His hand drifted toward his gun. Boys, it looks like we got ourselves a situation here. What happened next unfolded with the strange clarity that comes in moments of mortal danger. Samuel saw Dowd's hand moving, saw the other 2 men reaching for their weapons, felt Wild tense beside him like a coiled spring. Time seemed to slow as he drew his own gun, muscle memory from years of frontier life taking over. The first shot came from Wild. Samuel hadn't even seen her draw. But suddenly there was a smoking Colt in her hand, and one of Dowd's men was falling from his horse, clutching his shoulder. Samuel's gun cleared leather a heartbeat later, the familiar weight of it steady in his hand. Marshal Dowd, Samuel called out, his gun trained on the lawman's chest. I suggest you reconsider your options. But Dowd was past reasoning. His gun was already clearing its holster, his face twisted with rage and wounded pride. Samuel pulled the trigger without conscious thought, the boom of the gunshot echoing across the empty land. Dowd jerked backward, his own shot going wide, and toppled from his horse to lie still in the dust. The third man, seeing his companions down, threw his hands up in surrender. I ain't dying for Dowd's pride, he called out. This ain't my fight no more. Samuel kept his gun trained on the man while Wild moved to check on the wounded one. Her face was grim as she straightened up. This won't live if he gets to a doctor. The marshal won't. The reality of what had just happened settled over Samuel like a weight. He'd killed a lawman, even a corrupt one, which made him as much a fugitive now as Wild. There would be questions, investigations, wanted posters. The life he'd built here was over. I'm sorry, Wild said, her voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for this to happen to you. Samuel looked at her standing there in the dust and gun smoke, her weapon still in her hand, her hair wild from the wind, and felt something click into place inside him. This woman, this fierce, damaged, magnificent woman, had been worth fighting for. Maybe that was what he'd been missing all these years since Martha died, something worth fighting for. Don't be sorry, he said, holstering his gun. Help me get these 2 loaded up. We need to think. They spent the next hour dealing with the practical aftermath of violence. The wounded man was conscious but weak, moaning about the pain in his shoulder. The one who'd surrendered turned out to be named Pete, and he was more than willing to cooperate in exchange for being allowed to ride away with his life. Dowd was taking money, Pete admitted as Wild bandaged his companion's wound. Had an arrangement with Thomas Murphy's family back in Kansas. They wanted the woman brought back for trial, but Dowd, he had other plans. Figured to collect the reward money and then settle some personal business before turning her in. The casual way he said it made Samuel's stomach turn. He'd heard stories about men like Dowd, lawmen who used their badges to cover their crimes, who saw the frontier as a place where they could indulge their worst impulses without consequence. What'll happen when you get back? Samuel asked. Pete shrugged. Dowd was working alone on this, off the books. Far as anyone knows, he never found the trail. Could be he just disappeared out here in the wilderness. Happens all the time. As the 2 men rode away, the wounded one swaying in his saddle but alive, Samuel and Wild stood watching them disappear into the distance. The immediate danger was past, but the larger problem remained. Wild was still a fugitive, and now so was he. I should go, Wild said quietly, tonight, before this gets any worse for you. Where? Samuel asked. Where would you go that men like Dowd wouldn't eventually find you? She didn't have an answer for that, and they both knew it. The frontier was vast, but it wasn't infinite, and a woman alone would always be vulnerable. That night, they sat by the fire in Samuel's front room, drinking coffee that had grown bitter from sitting too long. Outside, an early winter storm was building, the wind rattling the windows and promising snow before morning. "Tell me about him," Samuel said eventually. "Your husband." Wilde stared into the fire for a long time before speaking. "Thomas wasn't always bad. When we met, he seemed like a good man, someone who could offer security, respectability. But the badge went to his head, and the drink made it worse. He started seeing me as just another thing he owned, something he could use however he pleased." She paused, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she was drawing warmth from it. "The night I killed him, he'd come home drunk again, angrier than usual because some outlaw had made him look foolish in front of his men. He took it out on me first, then little Sarah Jennings came to the door, crying because her mama was sick and she didn't know what to do." Wilde's voice became steady, matter of fact, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. "He grabbed that little girl, started unbuttoning his pants, telling her she was old enough to learn what men needed from women. I knew if I didn't stop him right then, he'd ruin her the way he'd ruined me. So I picked up the carving knife and I put it in his heart." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Samuel felt a rage building in his chest, not at Wilde but at the world that had forced her to make such a choice, at men who used their strength to hurt instead of protect. "You saved her," he said simply. "I did," Wilde agreed. "But the law doesn't see it that way. Thomas's family has money, influence. They painted me as a scheming woman who murdered her poor husband in cold blood. I ran because staying meant hanging." Samuel stared into the fire, thinking about justice and law and the vast difference between them. He thought about Martha, about how she'd always stood up for what was right even when it wasn't easy. He thought about the little girl Wilde had saved, probably safe now because of one woman's courage to act when action was needed. "My real name is Catherine," Wilde said suddenly. "Catherine Elizabeth O'Brien. My friends used to call me Katie before everything changed." "What do you want me to call you?" Samuel asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. "No one's called me Katie in 5 years," she said finally. I'd forgotten how it sounded. Over the weeks that followed, as winter settled over the ranch in earnest, Samuel found himself falling in love not with the wild, fierce woman who'd arrived at his door, but with Katie, the person she revealed herself to be when she felt safe enough to let her guard down. She laughed more, genuine laughter that lit up her whole face. She sang Irish songs while she worked, her voice clear and sweet in the crisp air. She told him stories about her family, about the green hills of Ireland that lived in her memory, about dreams she'd carried across an ocean only to see them buried in a Chicago cemetery. Samuel told her about his dreams too, about the ranch he'd envisioned with Martha, full of children and laughter and life. They talked about books they'd read, places they'd like to see, the way the mountains looked different in every kind of light. Slowly, carefully, they began to build something together that was theirs alone. Christmas Eve found them snowed in, the storm that had been threatening for days finally arriving with a vengeance. They sat close together on the couch, sharing warmth and watching the fire paint dancing shadows on the walls. Katie had been quiet all day, thoughtful in a way that made Samuel nervous. "I've been thinking," she said suddenly. "About spring." Samuel's heart sank. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it would come eventually. "Thinking what?" "About leaving," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. "About moving on before I bring you any more trouble." Samuel set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "Is that what you want? To leave?" "No," she admitted, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "But wanting something and being able to have it aren't the same thing." "Katie," he said, using her real name deliberately, watching how her eyes softened when he said it. "I've been dead for 3 years, just walking around pretending to be alive. You changed that. You brought me back to life, and I'm not willing to go back to the grave just because some corrupt marshal thinks he can take what isn't his." She looked at him with something that might have been hope, fighting against years of learned caution. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we run together, if running's what it takes. I'm saying we fight together if fighting's what's needed. I'm saying I love you, Katie O'Brien, and I'm not letting you face this world alone anymore." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they could cross. Katie's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink away, her throat working as if she were trying to swallow words too big to speak. "I love you too," she whispered softly. Help me, I love you too. They came together then with the desperate tenderness of two people who'd found something precious in a world that seemed determined to destroy beautiful things. Samuel tasted salt tears on Katie's lips and realized some of them were his own. They made love that night with the storm raging outside, holding each other like the world might end before morning. Spring brought new challenges and new hopes in equal measure. Word came through the informal network of frontier communication that the law in Kansas had bigger problems than one missing widow. A series of bank robberies had drawn attention away from old cases, and with Dowd missing and presumed dead, there was no one pushing Katie's case forward. But more than that, things were changing on the frontier itself. Colorado was pushing toward statehood, bringing with it new laws, new protections, new ways of thinking about justice. Samuel began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build a life here after all. Katie bloomed with the spring grass, her laughter becoming a regular sound around the ranch. She'd started a small garden behind the house, talking to the plants as she worked in a way that reminded Samuel of how Martha used to talk to her flowers. But Katie was different from Martha, fiercer and more independent, shaped by hardships that had taught her to rely on herself above all else. "I want to marry you," Samuel told her one morning as they watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold, properly, with a preacher and papers and everything legal. Katie's smile was radiant, but it faded quickly. "Samuel, I can't. I'm still legally married to a dead man, and even if I wasn't, the scandal would follow us everywhere. Then we'll make our own ceremony," he said, "hair on our land with the mountains as witnesses. Let the law catch up to what's right in its own time." They married themselves on a warm June morning, exchanging vows they'd written together while standing in the wildflower meadow beyond the house. Samuel had never felt anything as right as the moment Katie said his name and promised to build a life with him, come what may. The first real test of their new beginning came in July, when a group of investors from Denver arrived with offers to buy the ranch. The railroad was coming through, they explained, and land values were about to soar. They offered Samuel enough money to start over anywhere he wanted, to disappear into anonymity if that's what he needed. Think about it. The lead investor, a well-dressed man named Harrison, urged, "You could buy a spread in California or head up to Oregon Territory. Make a fresh start where nobody knows your history." That night, Samuel and Katie walked their land together, following the creek that wound through the valley, listening to the cattle settling for the night, breathing air that smelled of sage and wildflowers and home. "We could do it," Katie said as they sat on a fallen log beside the water. "Take the money and start over somewhere new." Samuel picked up a handful of rich earth, letting it run through his fingers. "This is where I buried Martha. This is where I learned to live again. This is where we fell in love." He looked at Katie, seeing the moonlight caught in her hair. "I don't want to run anymore, Katie. I want to stand and fight for something, even if it means we might lose everything." "We've already lost everything once," Samuel replied. "Both of us. And we survived. We can survive whatever comes next, as long as we face it together." Katie leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm and real. "Then we stay." They turned down the investor's offer the next morning, watching the disappointed men load back into their carriage and head toward town. Samuel felt a deep satisfaction in the gesture, the simple act of choosing to stay and fight for what mattered. The autumn of their second year together brought both celebration and sorrow. Katie was pregnant, a development that filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure, but it also brought new urgency to their situation. A child would need legal protection, legitimate status, a future unmarked by their parents' complicated past. Samuel made a trip to Denver in November, seeking out lawyers and officials who might help them navigate the legal maze of Katie's situation. What he found was a territory in transition, old ways of thinking giving way to new possibilities. A young lawyer named William Hayes took an interest in their case, seeing it as a chance to challenge laws that left women with no recourse against violent husbands. "Public opinion is changing," Hayes explained during one of their meetings. "The suffrage movement, the temperance unions, they're making people think differently about women's rights. A case like your wife's, defending herself and a child against a violent drunk, it could be a rallying point." The legal process would be long and uncertain, Hayes warned, but there was hope. New precedents were being set, old assumptions challenged. It wouldn't be easy, but it might be possible. Samuel returned to the ranch with cautious optimism, only to find Katie pale and quiet, moving carefully as if she were in pain. The baby had been lost. She told him with the kind of emptiness that comes after crying until there are no tears left. It had happened while he was away, and she'd faced it alone except for the ministrations of Doc Patterson from town. They mourned together that winter, holding each other through the long nights and short days, finding comfort in shared grief rather than letting it drive them apart. The loss brought them closer somehow, united them in a way that joy alone never could have. They were partners now in sorrow as well as happiness, bound by more than love. Spring returned as it always did, indifferent to human suffering but somehow offering hope anyway. Katie planted her garden again, her movements gentle but determined. Samuel expanded the herd, making plans for the future with the stubborn optimism of someone who'd learned that life continued whether you were ready for it or not. The letter from William Hayes arrived in May, carried by the same postal rider who'd brought Samuel news of the outside world for years. Hayes wrote that he'd found a sympathetic judge, a territorial magistrate named Eleanor Morrison who was known for her unconventional views on women's rights. If Katie was willing to return to Kansas and face trial, Hayes believed they could win. More than that, they could set a precedent that might protect other women in similar situations. "It's a risk," Samuel said after reading the letter aloud. "If we lose, you could hang." Katie was quiet for a long time, staring out at the mountains that had become her refuge. "And if we win, you're free, we're free. We can build the life we want without looking over our shoulders." That night, Katie sat at the kitchen table writing letters by lamplight. One to Hayes, accepting his offer to represent her. One to the territorial governor, requesting safe passage to Kansas for the trial. One to Sarah Jennings, the little girl she'd saved, now grown old enough to testify about what Thomas Murphy had tried to do to her that night. "Are you sure about this?" Samuel asked as she sealed the envelopes. Katie looked up at him, her green eyes bright with determination. "I'm tired of running, Samuel. I'm tired of being afraid. If we're going to have a future together, I want it to be built on truth, not secrets." The trial took place in Topeka in August of 1889, nearly 3 years after Katie had fled Kansas. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and supporters from the growing women's rights movement who saw Katie's case as a crucial test. William Hayes had assembled a strong defense, but the prosecution, led by a political ambitious district attorney named Blackwood, was determined to make an example of her. Samuel sat in the front row every day, watching Katie face her accusers with quiet dignity. She told her story simply and honestly, leaving out nothing, accepting responsibility for Thomas Murphy's death, while maintaining that she'd had no choice. The details that emerged during the trial painted a picture of systematic abuse that made even hardened frontier men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah Jennings, now 18 and married with a child of her own, testified with tears streaming down her face about the night Katie had saved her. She was already bleeding from where he'd hit her. Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "But when she saw what he meant to do to me, she didn't hesitate. She stepped between us and told him he'd have to kill her first." Patterson made the journey from Colorado to testify about Katie's condition when she'd arrived at the ranch, the healed breaks in her ribs and arm that spoke to prolonged abuse. Even Pete, the surviving member of Dowd's posse, had been convinced to testify about the marshal's real intentions and his admission that Thomas Murphy had been taking bribes. But the most powerful testimony came from Katie herself. On the final day of the trial, she stood before the packed courtroom and spoke not as a defendant pleading for mercy, but as a woman claiming her right to exist without fear. "I killed Thomas Murphy," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I killed him because he was going to rape a child. And because I knew that if I didn't stop him that night, he would kill me eventually and then find other victims. I'm not asking you to forgive me for taking a life. I'm asking you to understand that sometimes the law fails to protect the innocent, and when it